He didn't notice the smell at first. It wasn't rot. Not the way you imagine it. Not the way a man expects it to hit him like a slap. It was subtler than that. Wet rope, old wood, iron that had been kissed by water for too long. A faint sweetness under it all. Like something that had been sealed up and was finally remembering how to breathe. Carl Logies stood over his well with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, lantern hung from a nail in the post, and both hands white-knuckled around the crank handle. The night was still enough that he could hear the water falling inside the shaft. Steady, hollow, a sound that made the darkness feel deeper than it ought to. The bucket chain clicked, link by link, as he worked it. The animals had refused the water that morning. Not just one horse, not just a finicky cow. All of them. The horses had nosed the trough and snorted back like they'd been burned. The cattle had leaned in, nostrils flaring, then pulled away with that dumb, stubborn certainty animals get when they know something and you don't. Carl had tried to laugh it off at first. Had tasted the water himself, cool on his tongue, metallic the way well water was supposed to be. No bitterness, no sourness, nothing that screamed poison. But the animals would rather go thirsty than drink it. So here he was, late on August 1st, 1922, draining his well by lantern light, telling himself he was being sensible, telling himself this was just another chore. A man takes care of his water. A man takes care of his land. Except the well had always been the one place on the property that didn't feel like it belonged to him. Even after a year, even after the deed and the fences and the barn and the farmhouse. After he'd sweated in the fields and mended boards and hauled feed and done all the small daily acts that should have stitched a man to a place, Carl still found himself walking past that well with his eyes a little averted, the way you walk past a stranger you don't trust. The water fell lower. The sound changed with it. Less splash, more slap, like wet hands hitting stone. Carl leaned over the rim, lantern in one hand now, and let the light drop down the shaft. At first, all he saw was blackness. Then, as the surface sank, the lantern's glow caught something far below, something pale and fixed, like a moon trapped underwater. Carl's breath tightened. A stupid thought came, uninvited and immediate. That's the figure. He told himself it was just his mind reaching for patterns. He told himself the pale shape could be anything. A stone, a board, a piece of old cloth that had fallen in and never come back out. But as the water continued to drain, the pale thing didn't move. And the longer he stared, the more he realized it wasn't pale because the lantern made it pale. It was pale on its own. Like skin that never saw sunlight. Like bone. Carl swallowed and forced himself to keep turning the crank. The chain clicked, the well-breathed damp air up at him. And somewhere behind him, out beyond the lantern's weak circle, his barn made a small, settling groan, the kind of sound wood makes in the night. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Because for almost a year now, Carl had lived his life by a routine he never admitted out loud. Every night, near the time he checked his animals, he would see a white silhouette on his land. And every night, it would go to the well and vanish. Carl's hand slipped on the crank. The chain jerked and rang. His lantern swung gently from the nail, light wobbling across the grass, across the worn boards of the well post, across the dirt where boots had made the same half-moon impressions day after day. Carl turned his head slowly, like a man expecting to see a face close to his shoulder. There was nothing there. Only the field and the barn and the farmhouse, sitting quiet under the Ohio sky. Only the soft, steady sound of draining water. Only the late summer air, warm enough to feel alive. Carl made himself look back down to the shaft. The pale shape waited. And the way it waited, patient, inevitable, made something in Carl's chest tighten with an old, familiar feeling. The feeling he'd had on the very first night he walked this property. The feeling that someone was watching him. A year earlier, summer of 1921, Carl Logies had walked across his new farm with a gun on his hip and a lantern in his hand, and pride in his bones like warm whiskey. It was late. The kind of rural late where the darkness doesn't come in city shades, doesn't come politely. It comes like a lid closing. The fields turned into a single dark body. The tree line became a black seam against the stars. Even the barn looked different, larger, more watchful, its angles sharper under moonlight. Carl had been a young man still, young enough to feel the thrill of ownership like it was a new muscle. He'd worked hard, he'd saved. He'd dreamed of land that was his, and he'd gotten it for a price that felt almost embarrassing. The sellers, people he barely knew, people who wouldn't quite meet his eyes, had been eager, too eager. They'd signed papers with hands that moved fast, as if ink itself could keep them from looking back. Carl remembered standing on the porch after they drove away, listening to the wagon wheels fade and thinking, their loss. He didn't ask why they'd wanted to be rid of the place so badly. Not because he wasn't curious, but because curiosity can get expensive. And Carl had always believed a man should take luck when it offered itself. The first weeks had been the good kind of lonely. Quiet mornings, work that made sense, animals that responded to care and routine, the land responding to effort, the farmhouse smelling of dust and sun-warmed boards. He told himself the sellers were probably just tired, probably couldn't keep up with the work, probably needed the money, probably... He kept finding himself circling around probably, because there had been something in their faces he couldn't name. Not exhaustion. Relief, maybe. Like a man stepping out of a place he believed might swallow him if he stayed. Carl didn't like to think about that. On that first night, he'd taken his lantern and walked toward the barn to check his horses and cattle one last time before bed. It was a simple thing, the kind of habit you form fast when you live alone. Halfway to the barn, the hairs on the back of his neck rose. That sensation wasn't subtle. It wasn't, maybe I'm imagining it. It was the sudden, animal certainty of being observed. Carl stopped. He turned, quick, lantern swinging, light cutting across the field. Nothing. The lantern wasn't strong enough to make day out of night. It illuminated only a small slice of the world. The rest remained a black wall, but he could see the ground around him. He could see the fence posts. He could see the grass moving in a faint breeze. He could see that there was no one close. His mind tried to be practical. Predator, it offered. Coyote. Something watching from the brush. Yet the night was quiet in a way that didn't feel like predator quiet. No urgent rustle, no frantic bird calls, just the steady, indifferent chorus of summer insects. Carl stood there with his lantern held out, feeling foolish and exposed. Then he told himself what a man tells himself when he doesn't want to admit fear. "You're new," he muttered, voice swallowed by the open field. "That's all. You're new here." He made himself keep walking. In the barn, the animals shifted and breathed in the dark. The horses snorted softly as he approached. The cattle's heavy bodies made slow, warm sounds. Carl ran his hand along a horse's neck, felt the reassuring solidity of muscle and hide. He busied himself. He did what men do when they're trying to outwork a feeling. and for a few minutes he forgot the watch sensation. Then, as he was finishing, it returned. Not as a thought, as a pressure, as if the air itself had eyes. Carl paused, lantern held still, and listened. Nothing. But the barn door stood open, framing a slice of night. Black field, fence line, the well post faintly visible like a crooked finger. Carl's throat went dry. He hated the idea of walking back to the house through that darkness. Hated it in a way that didn't match the situation. He had a gun. He had a lantern. He had nothing to fear. Still, he checked his gun on his hip, the gesture less about readiness than reassurance, and stepped out. He walked fast. Not running, because that felt like surrender, but fast enough that his boots scuffed dirt, fast enough that his lantern bobbed and made shadows leap across the field. Halfway to the farmhouse, something caught his eye on the far side of the property. At first, it was just a difference in darkness, a patch of pale that didn't belong. He stopped. He raised the lantern and aimed it, arm straining. The lantern's glow didn't reach far, but it reached far enough. Someone was standing near his well. Not close. Not close enough for Carl to see a face, but close enough to see the outline. A human shape, pale against the dark like a cutout. A white silhouette. Carl's heart thumped once, hard, as if it had bumped into something. "Hey!" he shouted, voice cracking in the open air. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The figure did not react, did not flinch, did not raise a hand, did not speak. It simply stood there, turned in Carl's direction, as if it had been waiting for him to notice. Carl took a step forward without thinking, lantern raised higher. "Who are you?" he repeated louder now, anger trying to cover the edge in his fear. The figure turned, slowly, and began to move away from him in the direction of the well. It didn't run. It didn't hurry. It moved like someone walking through a familiar room. Carl's mind snapped to the simplest explanation. Trespasser. Thief. Someone scouting his place. Someone who'd been watching him all evening. The very thing his neck had warned him about. A surge of hot indignation rose in him. This was his farm, his land, his animals. He drew his gun and started after the figure. His lantern swung, light lurching across the grass. For a moment he lost the pale shape in the wobble of shadows. Then he found it again, farther now, closer to the well. Carl ran harder, boots pounding, breath rasping, the gun heavy in his hand. The white silhouette seemed to slide rather than sprint, and that made Carl run faster because the only way to make sense of it was to believe the distance was tricking him. He reached the well out of breath and furious. The pale figure was gone. Just gone. Carl stood there, lantern held out, gun raised, looking around wildly as if the world had played a trick and he could catch it if he turned his head fast enough. There were no footprints in the dark grass that he could see. No sound of someone hiding. No rustle in the brush. No quick breathing, only his own panting, loud and uneven. Carl shouted into the night, the words spilling out of him in a way that felt both brave and desperate. "I've got a gun," he yelled. "I'm not afraid to use it. You hear me? Don't come back here." The darkness absorbed the threat without answer. Carl stayed there longer than he wanted to admit, staring into the field, waiting for the white shape to reappear so he could prove to himself he hadn't imagined it. It didn't. Eventually, when the night seemed to settle again, Carl backed away from the well and ran the rest of the way to the farmhouse. He locked the door behind him, then he checked it twice. And when he finally lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he told himself what he had to tell himself to sleep. It was a neighbor. It was a wanderer. It was a thief. It was anything but what his stomach had whispered when the figure vanished, anything but a ghost. Morning light made the farm ordinary again. That was one of the farm's crueler tricks, how easily daylight could erase the night, how it could make the barn look like a barn, the well look like a well, and the field look like nothing more than land waiting to be worked. Carl went through his day with a stubborn normalcy, feeding animals, checking fences, doing chores that made him feel like the place belonged to him. When his mind drifted toward the figure, he pushed it away. That night, around the time he normally checked the barn before bed, he saw it again. Not near the farmhouse. Not at the barn. Out on the side of the property, far enough that it felt like it lived in the distance. A white silhouette standing still, watching. Carl's throat tightened with anger this time. Anger at the trespasser, anger at the fear, anger at the fact that something had dared to put itself on his land twice. He grabbed his lantern and his gun and marched out. The figure turned and moved away toward the well. Carl chased it. By the time he reached the well, it vanished. The same pattern, the same patient disappearance. The same sick feeling in his stomach afterward, like he'd been made foolish by the dark itself. He slept poorly, woke sweating, told himself it was coincidence. But the next night, it happened again, and again, and again. Almost every single night, always around the same time, around 9:30. Near the hour, Carl would head to the barn, and then back toward the farmhouse. He would spot the pale figure at a distance, always watching. And when he shouted and ran, it would retreat toward the well and disappear near it, as if the well were a door that only it knew how to open. Carl tried different things. He tried approaching quietly, lantern lowered, as if surprise might catch it. The figure still moved away with that unhurried certainty and vanished. He tried circling wide, trying to cut it off. He would lose sight of it in the field's darkness, and then it would be gone. Once, rage overtook sense. He fired his weapon in its direction. The gunshot cracked through the night like a whip, echoing off barnwood and fence posts. The figure did not scream, did not stumble, did not fall. It simply continued its slow movement toward the well and vanished like mist. After that, Carl stopped telling himself it was a man. Or rather, he stopped believing it. You can insist on practicality only so long before reality becomes something else entirely. And Carl was not a superstitious man. He didn't grow up with ghost stories as anything but entertainment. But he had eyes. He had a mind that could keep count. He had a body that reacted with the same cold rush of dread every night, no matter how much he scolded himself. By winter, the routine had hardened into something terrible and predictable. He would do his evening chores, the sky darkening early. He would stand at the barn door with his lantern and feel that familiar prickle along his neck, the sense of being watched from beyond the reach of light. Then he would see it, always at a distance, always pale, always waiting. Carl found himself adjusting his entire life around that hour. He hated that. Hated the way the figure made him plan his evenings, like a prisoner with a schedule. Yet, this was the strange thing, he also clung to the predictability, because the figure didn't touch his animals. It didn't break into his house. It didn't threaten him directly. It just watched and moved and vanished, night after night after night. Carl's fear became a quiet companion, something he didn't speak about, because what would he say? To whom? There's a ghost on my property? In a rural town, people would either laugh or look at him with that careful expression that meant this man is unwell. So Carl kept it to himself. He made a new normal of dread. And every time the figure vanished near the well, Carl would glance at that dark mouth of stone and think, briefly, irrationally. It's tied to that. But he never drained it, never probed it, never went down into the question. Because a man can live with a haunting if he can pretend it's separate from his hands. A man can live with fear as long as he doesn't have to put a name to its cause. Then came August 1st, 1922. The animals refused the water. That alone would have been enough to force Carl's hand. A farmer can ignore his own nerves, but he can't ignore thirst in his livestock. Thirst meant sickness. Sickness meant loss. Loss meant a farm sliding out from under him like mud. Carl watched his horses shy away from the trough, their eyes wide and glossy, and he felt something like anger again. Anger at the inconvenience, at the disruption, at the way the farm demanded his attention in ways he couldn't control. He tasted the water. It tasted fine. But the animals knew something he didn't, and that knowledge sat between them like a wall. So he made a decision. He would drain the well, clean it out, let it refill. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he'd been foolish not to do it sooner. He told himself 100 things. But as he walked toward the well with his tools, lantern swinging from his hand, he couldn't stop thinking about the white silhouette and its ritual retreat. It had always gone there, as if it belonged there, as if it wanted him to look. Now, late at night, he cranked the mechanism and listened to the water fall away. As the level dropped, the lantern light reached farther down, and the pale shape at the bottom became less like a trick of light and more like an answer. Carl stared, blinking hard, mouth slightly open like a man caught in a private sin. There were angles to it, curves, the shape of something that had once been whole. He cranked again, slower now, and felt his forearms tighten with more than effort. He leaned closer. The pale thing did not move. The water sank. The air rising from the shaft felt colder. Carl's stomach rolled as the outline sharpened into something he could no longer explain away. It wasn't a stone. It wasn't cloth. It was a body. Not the way bodies look in stories. Not fresh, not bloody. Time had taken everything soft. Time had eaten it down to what remained, the way time always does. But the shape was unmistakable in its human stubbornness. Limbs folded wrong, bones pale, clothing clinging in tatters. Carl stumbled back a step, lantern shaking. For a moment he couldn't breathe, as if the sight had grabbed his lungs. Then he swallowed hard and forced himself to act like a man who knew what to do. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He backed away from the well, one careful step at a time, as if turning his back might invite something to rise. He went to the farmhouse and got the sheriff. By the time the sheriff arrived, the night had begun to thin at the edges. That gray, pre-dawn light that makes everything feel drained of warmth. The sheriff's boots scuffed the dirt around the well. He leaned over and looked down, lantern held out, and his face changed in a way that told Carl everything before any words were spoken. "You did the right thing," the sheriff said, voice low. Carl stood a few feet back, hands shoved deep into his pockets, like he could hide his own trembling. The sheriff's men worked carefully, rope and hooks in grim patience. When the remains came up, they came up like history dragged into daylight. Skeletal, decomposed, undeniable. Carl watched without blinking, because if he blinked, he feared he would see the white silhouette standing at the edge of the field, watching him watch. The sheriff asked questions. Carl answered in short phrases, his voice sounding far away in his own ears. At some point, the sheriff said a name. "Him," he murmured almost to himself. That's Henry Lipenstick." Carl's mouth went dry. "Who?" he managed. The sheriff looked at him, and in that look was the weight of a story Carl didn't yet know. "A farmhand," the sheriff said. "Went missing 5 years ago. Worked this place when Frank Lerman owned it." Carl felt his gut sink, as if the well had pulled on him through the ground. Frank Lerman. The name meant nothing to him at first. Then it did. The property had belonged to another man before the sellers who'd given Carl such a bargain. A man who had employees. A man who had left town abruptly. The sheriff kept talking, and as he did, the past assembled itself in Carl's mind like a picture coming into focus. When Henry Lipenstick disappeared, the town had shrugged. Henry had no family nearby, no close friends to make noise. A young man without roots was easy to lose. Most people assumed he'd simply left. But one neighbor hadn't believed that. A woman who lived near enough to see and hear things. She'd told the sheriff she suspected Frank Lerman had done something. "Frank and Henry argued all the time," the sheriff said, eyes narrowed as if seeing old days. "Money, work, that sort of thing." The sheriff had started looking into it back then. And right as the investigation began, Frank Lerman had sold the farm and moved away. No evidence, no body. The sheriff had been forced to close the case. Until now. Until Carl, trying to fix an animal problem, had drained his well and found what the ghost had been orbiting. Autopsy later would reveal blunt force trauma to the head. Homicide. Frank Lerman was arrested. Frank Lerman was found guilty of second-degree murder. Carl sat in the courtroom, if only briefly, if only once, and watched a man's life judged by strangers. But the judgment didn't last. Frank served only 7 months. Then the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Released. Carl heard that news like a second death. Not because he cared about revenge, not because he wanted blood, but because something about the year he'd lived through, the nightly white silhouette, the watching, the vanishing at the well, had begun to feel like a moral structure. Like the world, ugly as it was, still contained lines you didn't cross without consequence. Frank Lerman had crossed them, and yet he walked free. That was the residue that stayed in Carl's throat even after everything else ended. The sense that the land had kept better account than the law ever would. When Henry's remains were pulled from the well, they noticed he was wearing a watch. It was still strapped to what was left of his wrist, an ordinary object that should not have survived in that dark, wet shaft. The watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m. The sheriff said it out loud, the way you say out loud the detail that makes everything in the room go quiet. "Stopped at 9:35, he said, voice thin. Carl felt the hair on his arms rise. Because for a year, nearly every night, he had seen the white silhouette around 9:30. Around the time he checked the barn, and he had chased it toward the well, and it had vanished, always near the well. He had never known the exact minute. Not at first, not until the haunting trained him into noticing the clock like a man keeping vigil. But the watch's stopped hands felt like the haunting signature. Not random, not myth, a timestamp. Carl went home that day with his stomach hollow. That night, he still went to the barn, still checked his animals, still carried his lantern out into the dark. And as if his life could not let him off easily, he felt that familiar prickle on the back of his neck. He stopped in the barn doorway and looked out. The field lay quiet. He waited. No white silhouette appeared. Carl stood there longer than necessary, lantern light trembling slightly with his breath. Nothing. He walked back to the farmhouse and locked the door, the old habit refusing to die. No figure appeared at the well. No pale watcher in the distance. It was over. When Henry Lipenstick was given a proper burial, Carl attended, hat in hand, the sun bright and indifferent overhead. The town murmured and shifted and looked solemn, in the way towns do when tragedy becomes real again. Carl stared at the ground and thought about the well, about the way it had held a man in darkness for 5 years, while everyone above lived as if nothing lay beneath their feet. After the burial, the white figure never returned, and it was believed, the word used by men who didn't want to claim certainty, that the owners who had sold Carl the farm at a discount had likely seen the same figure, likely felt the same watched sensation, likely lived by the same dread schedule. They had done what Carl hadn't done at first. They had left. Carl stayed. Carl endured. Carl found the truth by accident, because his animals refused to drink what his pride had accepted. And afterward, when the nights returned to normal, he should have felt relief. He did, in a way. But relief is not always peace. Because even with the haunting gone, Carl found himself waking at the same time some nights, sometime after 9:30, heart slightly quickened, as if his body still expected the field to hold a pale watcher. Sometimes he would lie there in the farmhouse, listening. No footsteps, no creak of boards, no voice calling his name. Just the usual summer chorus, just the old familiar farm sounds. And yet on certain nights, he could swear he heard it. Not a scream, not a whisper, just the faintest, most ordinary sound. A tiny metallic click, like a watch hand trying, once again, to move past 9:35. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session. Sleep well.